All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final meeting of the Rules Advisory Committee for Division 602, the Place-Based Water Planning Fund. As you all know by now, my name is Lily Prawl, and I'm the planning coordinator for the Oregon Water Resources Department. And I am joined today, as usual, by my colleagues, Margot and Kim, who are here to support our discussion today. As with our last RAC meetings, this meeting is open to the public and is being recorded. The recording will be posted to the OWRD YouTube channel and linked to our rulemaking website within the next day or two. Just some friendly reminders about how we run these meetings. We ask that if you're not speaking, you remain on mute. As we go through our agenda today, we ask that you please use the raise hand feature to indicate when you'd like to speak, and I'll call on you. Because this meeting is being recorded and posted, we ask that you try to limit the use of the chat feature in Zoom as much as possible so people that might be watching later can understand the flow of the discussion. If you're joining us today as a member of the public and are not part of the RAC, please remain muted and off camera until the end of the meeting, when we will have some time set aside for public comment. If you're planning to provide public comment, please indicate that in the chat as soon as you're able so that we can make sure that we're allocating enough time at the end of the meeting for that comment. And then finally, I just want to remind everyone that we have a rulemaking webpage. So if you are looking for any of the materials that we're discussing today, you can find them on that webpage. And I'm going to put the link to it in the chat just for everybody's reference. All right. Let's move on to the agenda for today. I am going to start by giving a high-level summary of the most recent round of updates to the draft rules, which we made based on comments we received at the last RAC meeting, and then I'll open the floor for any comments about those changes. Then we'll continue our discussion we started last time about potentially adding some new rules around contracting authority, technical assistance, and program evaluation. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll have a discussion on the racial equity, economic, and fiscal impacts of these rules. If there is no public comment, we'll plan to go through at 2:11 a.m. And then, as always, the times on this agenda are estimates, and we will adapt as is needed. So let's just dive right in. As you hopefully have all seen in the materials we sent out last week, we have considered all the feedback from the last RAC meeting and all of the written feedback that RAC members provided, and we updated the draft rules to version 11.1. You can find that version along with the feedback table where we have summarized and responded to all of your feedback on our rulemaking webpage. And I will put the links to those documents in the chat as well, so you can follow along on those documents if that is helpful. My plan for this part of the agenda is to just provide that high-level summary of the red line edits we made, and then we'll pause at the end to see if there's any additional feedback we should be considering as we prepare these rules for public notice. All right, so I'm just going to talk a lot for a couple of minutes. So just to orient you to these slides, as we go through, if you get lost about where we are in the rules, the upper blue box will have the section we're talking about, and then the rest of the slide will have the specific changes. So starting with the definition section, we talked through this at the last meeting and came up with a definition for facilitator, which means a neutral party that works to ensure a collaborative process and supports consensus building. Moving on to the section that describes eligible grant types. At the last RAC meeting, we talked through a suggestion to add language that would ensure that shared governance agreements and place-based plans would meet the requirements in OWRD guidance. In response, we developed the following language. Eligible plan development grants develop a place-based integrated water resources plan for a planning area consistent with a shared governance agreement using place-based integrated water resources planning and following the process, content, and structure provided by the department. Moving on to the grant evaluation criteria. Each grant type contains an evaluation criterion that used to say strategic priorities determined by the director. We heard at the last RAC meeting that we should provide clarity around this evaluation criterion to increase transparency and to ensure that grantees know what these strategic priorities are when they are filling out their grant applications. So we added elements for clarity, and the evaluation criterion now says strategic priorities identified in the IWRS, the department's strategic plan, or by the director and included in grant solicitation materials. In reviewing the last RAC meeting, I realized that I forgot to go over changes we made in the draft rules version 10.3 to the evaluation criteria for post-plan coordination grants. So I just wanted to rectify that error now as we're talking about grant evaluation criteria and go over those specific ones for the post-plan coordination grants. Again, these changes showed up as red line edits in version 10.3 and then were incorporated into version 11.1. It's been a while since we talked about this, but as a reminder, we had heard that the original list of evaluation criteria for post-plan coordination grants was confusing because some planning collaboratives would have recently received state recognition and would not have a history from which to evaluate, while other planning collaboratives would have been going on for longer and shouldn't necessarily be directly evaluated against those newer groups. So in response, we broke up the evaluation criteria to be reflective of that dichotomy. These rules say that if it is a newly recognized plan, its application may be given priority. And then for collaboratives that have been implementing for longer, we have kept the same evaluation criteria, a demonstration of the pursuit of plan strategies and actions that continue to represent a balance of in-stream and out-of-stream water interests and a commitment to collaboration and place-based planning principles. We updated B based on RAC feedback that we should be evaluating based on progress, aligning with the plan's implementation strategies and representation of balanced water interests. And then C and D here are evaluation criteria that show up in all the other grant types. So, okay. Error rectified. Let's move on to state recognition of plans. We heard that we should be clear here about what the evaluation metrics for plan review are. So we removed the language around evaluation metrics provided by the department and added language here that mirrors what was added earlier for planning development grants. That is, the plan review team shall review plans for adherence to the definition of a place-based integrated water resources plan, place-based integrated water resources planning, and the related process, content, and structure provided by the department. This language is added again in sub 3 of the section for consistency's sake. So now it reads 3, a plan may be recognized by the commission if it meets the definition of a place-based integrated water resources plan, was developed using place-based integrated water resources planning, follows the process, content, and structure provided by the department, and upon recommendation by the director. At the last RAC meeting, we talked a lot about agency support for plan implementation. There was conversation about what support meant and whether there was a statutory basis for the language, the department shall support implementation. In the RAC, we came to an agreement about new language that we have reflected here. And that is the department, in consultation with other relevant state agencies, shall identify, document, and communicate to collaboratives which plan strategies are consistent with an agency's mission, authorities, and priorities, and whether and how they may be supported by those agencies as resources and capacity allow. We also talked about how state recognized plans may be considered in the IWRS. We added the language here in consultation with other agencies to be reflective of the interagency nature of the IWRS, and added the individual language to clarify that strategies do not have to occur across multiple groups to be considered. Okay, let's move on to match requirements. We heard that the language around pending commitments of funding should be clarified to more accurately reflect its meaning. So we updated that language to match funds. Sorry, I do feel like I'm going fast to these, so I apologize. Moving on to the section on the grant application process, we added the word shall to reflect that the department shall be reviewing applications based on the evaluation criteria in section 6 of the rules. And then similar language was added to sub 5 The director shall make grant funding decisions based on grant evaluation criteria in section 6, in addition to the other items listed here. Okay. Moving on to the section on grant agreement and conditions. Based on your feedback, we removed sub 3, no geographic area may be served by more than one grant from the fund at a time. We think the grant evaluation criteria will effectively weed out the concern we initially had around parallel processes occurring, and agree that this could add unnecessary restrictions, so we removed it. There was also feedback that we should be adding language around using a neutral facilitator for plan development, 2, ensuring a collaborative process and adherence to the principles of place-based integrated water resources planning in the state's IWRS, and 3, following the process, content, and structure provided by the department and necessary to meet the definitions of plan and planning. There were suggestions to add this type of language in different places in the draft rules, but we thought the cleanest way to do it was to just add it in this section as grant requirements. Harmony, I see you have your hand up. I think we're gonna wait for feedback on the rules until we get through all of these. Is that okay? You put your hand down, sorry. Okay. Let's see. All right, so I think this is the last. Yes, this is the last one. So let's talk about changes to the public notice and comment. We added some language to clarify timeline for public comment. For application review, it would take place prior to the application review team making a recommendation. And for state recognition, it would be prior to a decision of state recognition, with all public comments reported to the commission for consideration. We also extended the public comment period to 45 days, as was suggested by a RAC member. Okay, now I'll stop talking at you. That is the end of the summary of the changes we made in the 11.1 version. Is there any additional feedback you want to provide on these changes? From here, we're going to move on to a discussion about potential new rules. So if there's anything that you would like to go back to, now is the time. And then after the RAC meeting, you'll have until the end of the day today to provide any written comment. But after that, we won't be taking any comments on these rules. So I see lots of hands have gone up. So Kaylin, I think you were first.
Thanks. If you can go back one slide, please, Lily. My question relates to a situation where a grant award process may not include an application review team, and wanting to ensure that public comment would still be available for that process. It seems like right now the notice is linked, the public notice, I guess, is linked to the application review team. And I don't know that that's intended.
I think that's a good catch, Kaylin. We added it because if we do have an application review team, we would want the public comment to be before they make a recommendation, right? But you're right, in other cases, if we're not using our application review team, I think we'd still want to have a public comment period. So I think we can adjust that language.
Okay, thank you.
Lisa.
Yeah, thanks. I have 2 comments. The first is on the 007 sub 5 language. I think you said we agreed to those changes at the last meeting. I just want to be clear. I mean, I don't think we did have agreement on whether or not to include that. As we already said in our written comments, but just that I'll highlight here, we think that addressing what the agencies have to do with the plans is beyond the scope of this rulemaking, which talked only about funding and the process for state recognition. So I just want to reiterate that from our written comments, that is a concern of ours. I think this language is a lot better than what we started with, but we still do have that concern. And then just the second comment or question that I have is, I still don't read the rules. There is the addition of the shared governance agreement now, but I still don't read the rules as really being clear as to who gets to participate in these processes and whether restrictions can be put on that. As we saw with the pilots, in some cases, for example, we weren't permitted to participate. So to me, that's an important kind of standard to have in here, and I don't know that we really got there.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. That's helpful. I think we talked about that when we were talking about definitions and like the definition of collaborative and the definition of community. And so if it's, I mean, that's good to know that it still feels like there isn't that like clear.
Yeah, I'm reading those definitions right now. I think I had thought that the shared governance agreement could sort of address eligibility as far as who is eligible, and I don't think it's in there. So I don't think it's in here. Okay.
Thanks. Harmony.
I'm very dark this morning. Good morning. I have a couple comments, and I will send them in writing as well. I continue to be concerned about the department's insistence on match requirements being secured prior to disbursement of funds. I think that's kind of exacerbates potential inequality or inequities, especially regarding capacity for communities that are just getting started on this journey. I do believe it makes sense to require that match be secured prior to final disbursement to show that there is this kind of partnership approach with the state and the community. But I do feel the department's current requirement to have it all up front is going to be challenging, especially because planning is one of the harder things to fund. In my experience with place-based planning, and this fund, this grant, served really as a seed or a magnet for other funding, but you really need time for, to plant the seed and water it, let it grow a little bit to attract that other funding. So I would just encourage the department to maintain some flexibility about match. And I think this will be one of the greatest inhibiting factors for communities that are just coming on board and trying to do this work. There's some kind of specific stuff I'll send in writing. I'm concerned about the inclusion of a requirement for a neutral facilitator as a condition of the grant. I think it should be encouraged. It should be encouraged. It should be part of the process. But there are times, at least in my experience with both the Harney and with the Mid-Coast, where funds were limited, and the work was able to continue, and funding was given to a project manager or a plan writer. Ideally, we would have funding for all of these things, but I'm just concerned that making it a condition of, maintaining the grant really limits flexibility to use those funds for other things. And it does kind of give, I think, preference towards using funding for facilitation, which isn't a bad thing. I just think it's unnecessarily restrictive. The addition of 2 45-day public comment periods, I think it's great to have public comment. To totally support two public comment periods. I would recommend including a minimum of 30 days in rules with the department discretion to extend that. Just thinking about timing of from when an application is received to the award, and trying to be reasonable in that time frame because people are trying to get moving and get started. Continue to have concerns about match, and I would I'm glad to see conversations about expanded scope. And yeah, look forward to that conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Harmony. Steve.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Lily and Kim for the work on the rules here. In regards to the last slide about state support of recognized plans, that's the one yeah, that one there. I would say this language isn't quite as strong as I had hoped for, but I think it's headed in the right direction. I guess my question is when would these things happen in relationship to the commission recognizing the plans? I think it would be nice to tie a when here. You know, is that within 90 days after the plan's recognized, or some way that the planning groups could know that they're going to get this sort of information from the state. And then my question is about the language around that the department may use a grant application review team. I was just kind of curious what the intent was there of it being a may. You just want flexibility for certain types of grants or tight timelines or whatever. But I highly encourage a plan review team whenever it's possible and feasible. But
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think that may is exactly right what you said. Like, it allows us the flexibility, although our preference would be to use a plan review team when possible. Kim, go ahead.
Yeah, I might note an example where a plan review team, we might choose not to use one because the value add may be limited, right? So after state recognition of a plan, right, folks then become eligible for the, I'm now not going to remember, are still calling them implementation coordination, right? But that sort of continued and if there are sufficient funds and they just went through an extensive review process, for them to have to apply again then for that grant funding after they were just state recognized and everything reviewed, doesn't seem like a good use of time and resources. And that might be an instance where we wouldn't use another plan or an application review team after there was a plan review team. And we may or may not consider, Kaylin, I understand the note on public comment in that instance. I wonder if there would be a way to, I'd have to think of how we would do public comment there once again to not have that it's not necessarily a duplication of effort, but then just like another thing, right? If there were multiple public comment periods in the process of being state recognized, to turn around and do another public comment period, to have that implementation coordination seems inefficient. So I'm just trying to think if there's a way we can keep that and have that language to make sure we're not missing public comment periods, but not need to have that duplication. And I have some responses to some of the other stuff folks said, but it looks like Kaylin has something to speak to on that piece. So we might go back to her.
Sure, I'll keep it brief, and I apologize for not being on screen. I've got back stuff going on today. But I guess I can see the desire to reduce duplication and conserve resources, and at the same time I'm struggling with these being two very different decisions, one being a decision around recognition of a state plan that has, or of a place-based plan that's been developed over some probably number of years, and the second being the distribution of limited state funding to support the next step of a plan. And so I think that there are different public comment intents, And that's what I'm trying to preserve here, is in the instance where we have exceptional demand and not exceptional resources to meet that demand in terms of planning funds. I'm thinking back to, when the initial call went out to do the pilots, and the, crushing response from places. I think that it's very important to preserve that comment on this process, and I'll be quiet now. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Kaylin. I would imagine, and we can think about how we'd word like this, that where there are limited resources, right? That changes things versus if there are sufficient, we want to move things forward.
Harmony, do you have something in response to the public comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to retract my previous comment because my brain was scrambled and I was thinking this was 2 public comment periods for just the grant. I didn't kind of like grasp that these were 2 totally different decisions. And yeah, I agree that this still maybe needs to be clarified. And I think for one, I don't read in that. I think maybe it's intended, but I don't read that the public will be able to comment on the recommendation. It's not clear what the public would be commenting on. And I do think like that's the most important time is like, well, I don't know. It's like, yeah, what is the most important time? But I do think the public should have an opportunity to see the ranking and recommendation of the application review team and to comment on that before it goes to the director for a decision. And so clarifying where that's at, I think, is quite important.
Thanks, Harmony. Kim, did you have other things?
Yes. Thank you, Harmony. Yeah, I think right now this is about making comments on the application. So it's good to know if folks think that that's not the appropriate time for the public comment. And I hear that it's on the recommendation, not on the applications prior to review. I also wanted to follow up on what Lisa shared about her and WaterWatch's view that the language of how agencies would support implementation of plans being outside of the authority and scope of the statute. And I just want to note that I'm not going to remember now the actual rule or the statute reference, but I have the House bill pulled up, and it notes that the commission may adopt rules, including rules that, and then sub E is describe how the implementation of actions outlined in a state recognized plan may be considered and supported. And I think that's why we're providing that clarification of what we mean and how we'll do that here in the rules. I appreciate Steve's note that it might be helpful to clarify when that will happen, and I think we'll need to think about that in order to, my gut is I don't necessarily, right, we want to provide that assurance and that communicate early, but I don't want to box us in because that is a new thing we haven't done previously, and I could see value in it coming with the recommendation for state recognition. But likewise, it can take some time. And so it might be better if it is within 90 days of a state recognized plan. So I think that's something we'll need to consider. And it looks like Lisa has something she would like to say.
Yeah, just really quickly, I mean, we were looking at the language for the scope of the rulemaking on WRD's webpage, which just says the funding process and process for state recognition. So, I think there's two separate issues. One is what's the scope of this rulemaking, which I think did not include this. And then the second is, what did the statute say? And I think we went over a lot of that, and this language is better on that point than what we've had. But I just want to be clear, there's kind of two points there. One is what's the scope of the rulemaking, and the other is what's consistent with the statute.
Got it. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay. Is there anything else in these sections that folks have comments on before we move on? Okay, great. We're right on track for timing. This is great. Okay, so let's move on to the expanded scope discussion that we started last time. As a reminder, we heard interest from several RAC members in expanding the scope of the rules, specifically that the rules should do more to describe interagency coordination, contracting authority, technical assistance, and program evaluation and improvement. As we discussed last time, there is a limit to what we can put into these rules around interagency coordination because statute does not compel any other agency to participate if they do not have the capacity, and we don't have the authority to put other requirements of other agencies into our rules. So that being said, to the extent possible, we weaved in language throughout the rules to encourage interagency coordination through agency consultation, which you guys have all seen in those draft rules. For the other pieces, contracting authority, technical assistance, and program evaluation improvement, we looked at what had been proposed and we developed some language that we want to discuss with you all today. I'll note that this language does not appear in the draft rules, but RAC member suggestions were included in the feedback table, and the purpose of the discussion today is really to help us decide if we should put these into the draft rules before they go out for public comment. So we started our discussion last month talking about adding new rules to clarify the department's authority to contract directly for services, which is outlined in the place-based planning statute in section 6. There is a long list of things in statute that the department may contract for, including those listed on this slide: efforts related to interagency coordination, situation assessments, the collection or development of data, data inventories, or other technical information related to planning. And then again, on this slide, I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can read them for yourselves. We have heard diverse opinions from RAC members, some strongly encouraging rules around this because of concern that the department would not use its authority unless it was in rule, and others expressed concern about adding rules around this because they are unnecessary and could limit the department's authority here. So we considered all of that feedback and put together some language we want to discuss with you all. Again, we're looking for feedback about whether this is something we should be including. If so, why? If not, what are concerns? I do want to note that the department can exercise its authority to contract directly for services, whether or not it's clarified in rule, which is why we don't suggest putting the statutory language verbatim in rule because it doesn't add anything. The real purpose of rules is to clarify and describe how the department will implement its statutory authority. So the language we put together is this: the department shall periodically identify ways it may use monies in the fund to most effectively further place-based integrated water resources planning as described in ORS 537873, section 6. What do folks think about this language? Are there concerns with putting it in? Do people want us to put it in? Pluses, minuses? What do people think? And I can give you a minute or two as you formulate thoughts, because I know you haven't seen this language before.
Lily, this is Kaylin. Would you be able to go back one slide to see these? I think it shows all of the different things it can do. Awesome, thank you.
And then there's 3 more that aren't listed on this slide because they didn't fit. They're up here, but the majority of them are here. Steve?
Well, I think it's helpful to the program and the people running the program to have some flexibility to use the fund for these things, which will further or advance place-based planning. I know when Harmony and I were coordinating the place-based planning pilot, it would have been nice to have sort of the flexibility to use a little bit of the money this way, for sure, for sure. So I support it. I support the department having the ability to do it. And I guess, it's in statute, so that authority exists just as it is with or without rules. And I would encourage the department to do it as needed, using good judgment um, to make good progress and et cetera. The sample language you put up, I think is, well-meaning. I don't know that it necessarily advances the ball, other than it sort of repeats that the department has that authority. But it actually maybe kind of limits, because what it says is identify ways. And identifying ways is a little bit different than actually doing it. So I don't know if that's it sounds like a restriction, or a limitation to me.
Yeah,
I would,
thanks, Steve.
I
I
would like
think
to
when
hear something
we,
that said, use the money as necessary as per ORS 537-8736.
thanks, Steve. Danette?
Yeah, I was just curious about your use of shall versus may. The department shall periodically identify that forces you to do it, and periodically is on some sort of a timeline. I'm assuming you're not going to do this all the time, so I don't know what the statute says.
Yeah,
I
the
don't-
statute.
I don't know if that was on your other slide, on the ABC slide.
It is.
Yeah,
So this is the statute.
yeah.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to why we did go back and forth on the shall or may, and appreciate folks' thoughts on those two options. And I appreciate, Steve, you noting like identify is not the same as used, and we don't want the language to be restricting. I think what we heard in the feedback was there was a concern that even though the department has the authority to contract, it will not use that authority, and that might be to the detriment of the program. There are times where if the department has sort of one contract with an entity that maybe any of the groups can access, that is a more efficient use of resources than each of the individual groups needing to subcontract out. Or there could be other instances where it is better for the department to contract directly for services. And I think that's where the shall came from, of like, it's not, it would require the department to at least be in that periodically make sure it's checking to see how it could deploy contracts, as opposed to simply relying on grant dollars to entities, to places. So that's the thought behind it, and it's helpful to know if that's not clear in the reading of the text, or if folks still, think shall is too restrictive or too big of a bar. I'll just note some comments in the chat. Harmony at first note supports inclusion. Kaylin noted the department may use monies instead of that shall. Harmony also noted that she agrees with Steve's comment and Danette's, and suggests consultation with other agencies. For instance, would love to have seen some money go towards ODFW's habitat prioritization project. We can contract with other state agencies. That is one of the parts of the authority. And Kaylin notes seems like another place to link to the biennial report. And I'll clarify, the biennial report, there isn't a requirement for OWRD to do a biennial report in the statute or rules, right, Lily? That is for places that have received state recognition in order for them to maintain state recognition.
Thanks, Kim. Keelan?
Thank you. I guess I'm getting tripped up on, I think there's also a biennial report for the IWRS implementation. And so that's the one that I was thinking of, because these two processes are both related to integrated water resources strategy and planning.
Thanks for clarifying that, Keelan.
Okay.
I think we'd have to think about that one. I can see some synergy there. This language is talking about OWRD identifying, and the IWRS will be an interagency work plan. But you're right, there, we would ideally be consulting our sister agencies. So I think that's something for us to think about how that might work.
I'll just note that Harmony put in the chat that she supports the idea of a biennial work plan that complements the IWRS. And that it would be great to tie these things together more intentionally. Any other thoughts on this particular language, adding this? I've heard we might need to tweak it a little, but generally there's no high concern about adding it, and there's support for adding it. Okay, Lisa. Oh, you're on mute.
It's been a long week. Yeah, so what's the mechanism? So shall periodically identify, is that like how would anybody know what what was identified? And I just don't quite understand what the process is here. Also, I kind of agree with Steve's comment that it seems to actually be a restriction on use of the money. Like, could you use the money in a month if you haven't done this yet?
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's it. What would the process be? I mean, you wouldn't do a rule, presumably. You'd do like a guidance memo or
Yeah, I think how it is done could be done in a number of different ways, and the rule language is drafted doesn't specify, and it maintains that flexibility. There some ways that this could be done would be like Lily as the program coordinator, putting together a spend, like doing a review and having it be part of a spend plan along with grants. So, right. So it could be, that could include looking at, what technical products we have ready and where we see gaps, right? So she could be consulting our technical analyst in that regard, talking with groups to see if there are themes, right? And what they need and where there could be a contract. I think the specific mechanism of how it would play out, that process would be developed and laid out.
well, can I
Guidance.
So, I mean, some of the language that had been proposed, which we discussed in our written comments, really turned this into a fund for only certain interests, whereas other interests were excluded from accessing the fund, which, is really against the spirit of collaboration in our view. So I would be concerned about some sort of non-transparent process I mean, having seen that language, I would be concerned about some non-transparent process for how these funds would be used. That seems to kind of give the department the authority to do something other than what's just stated in statute. So I think we need to be really careful there. And if we're going to have a periodically identify ways that may use monies type of process, we should lay out some of the sideboards. And those would be, sort of to ensure that it is an inclusive and balanced way of using the money. So I guess that would be I'm just
yeah, no, I appreciate noting that. I think we want to make sure it is in the spirit of place-based planning. And I appreciate the desire for transparency. I think that is important. I also know that sometimes, like, I don't want this to be restrictive, and I appreciate what you noted of, like, if it's not identified, we can't use it, right? So say there's the OSU is working on a statewide sort of conference and get together, right? Perhaps we might determine that a good, use of funds is to provide some cost match to that and have like a special track for supporting the place-based planning groups, right? And they're going to, maybe they'll be there anyway, and that could be efficient. I'd also wouldn't want to create too much process where we couldn't identify those opportunities and be able to seize them. So it's finding that balance, because I agree, we don't want this to be a special interest, lack of transparency, but how do we not have too much process where we miss opportunities?
Right. I mean, periodically identify ways to me sounds broader than just being able to act on an opportunity. It's programmatic. But yeah, we can, by the end of the day, we can think about some other language. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your thoughts on this. If there's nothing else about this, we can move on to technical assistance. So a big piece of the partnership between the state and planning groups is the provision of technical assistance. And this technical assistance can be provided proactively, or in other words, like before a group asks for it. The department right now is working on preparing proactive technical assistance for future planning groups. During the pilot, technical assistance was mostly provided in response to planning group requests, and we do envision that pathway still existing in the future, as each planning group is unique and will have different technical assistance needs that we won't be able to predict. There was a suggestion by a RAC member to put this responsive pathway of technical assistance into rule. So we took that language and made some updates and wanted to present it to you all today for discussion. And the language is: the department, in consultation with other relevant state agencies, shall develop a system for receiving, prioritizing, and responding to requests for technical assistance to support place-based integrated water resources planning. Just wanted to give everyone a minute or two to think about that and then open the floor. How does that sit with you all as an addition to the rules?
If I extrapolate past comments, I could see that and I want to check if folks would be supportive of if this language shall develop and publish, right, that transparency piece of making known what that system is for technical assistance.
Thanks, Kim. Lisa?
Yeah, I think something like this is helpful, more transparency on the technical assistance process and how you get yours into the queue, I think is helpful. I do think we need some also process at the collaborative level for
Mm.
how these things get presented to the department. I don't know if that made it into like the shared governance agreement, but I think the process needs to be clear to everybody participating in a collaborative, and there needs to be, we need to make sure they're sort of equitably moving up the chain before they even get to the department. So maybe we could add some kind of parallel language into the shared governance agreement or something like that.
A good point. Thanks, Lisa. Chris.
Yeah, thanks. I've missed a couple meetings, so this might be a inappropriate question or one that has already been kind of answered, but I'm kind of confused that, technical assistance is just one of the direct contract services that the department could provide. Is there so I'm wondering if technical assistance can just be replaced with direct contracted services. I would think that you would need, some system to receive, prioritize, and respond to all of the different contracted services. And so I'm just wondering why maybe we're calling this one out when, some of those other ones would be, I feel like somewhat similar, that you'd want that transparency and you'd want to understand how those requests were being received. So yeah, just wondering if why the distinction for the technical assistance on this? Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Kim, I see you're unmuted. Do you have a?
Yeah, I didn't realize I was unmuted, but I'm happy to that is a good question and feedback, Chris. I think when we have in the pilot phase, technical assistance was really in how other department resources were used in support of place-based planning. And so I think that's what we were thinking of here, right? Just having that transparency and clarity of how do folks, we have some really smart technical folks, right, with some local knowledge, and how do we make it clear and equitable in accessing those resources. But I appreciate noting, and we have been thinking about like what could be contracted out versus what really is most appropriate for the department to do or most efficient with our resources. And so yeah, I think we might think about how to make sure the spirit of all those things is reflected in this language and really clear, because I'm not sure it is. That's colored by the experience of the pilot phase. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Any other thoughts about this language?
I'll note from in the chat, I'm sorry, I haven't been tracking. So Kaylin notes she supports the addition of and publish when it comes to this language. Harmony asks maybe just assistance rather than technical assistance. And then proposes alternative language that we might consider, specifically the department in consultation with other relevant state agencies will develop and maintain a public process for receiving, prioritizing, and responding to requests for assistance to support place-based integrated water resources planning. And Brian gave that a thumbs up. And then Peggy notes, reality is other agencies might not be provided with the money to respond. I certainly want their interaction, but also want to fully recognize the funding challenges. That's just some of what's going on in the chat.
An active chat today. Thanks, everyone. Okay, let's move on to the final piece that we're discussing about new rules. And those are about program evaluation and improvement. So the department, as you all know, the department did a big effort around this in 2022 with the place-based planning independent evaluation. This language was proposed by a RAC member and refined by the department, which would require periodic program evaluation in the future. The language is the department, in consultation with other relevant state agencies, collaboratives, and other interested parties, shall periodically conduct a program evaluation and implement strategies for improvement. And as before, I think I'll give you guys a minute just to take it in and then open the floor to comments. How does this sit with you as an addition to the rules? Do folks have thoughts? Caitlin.
Thanks, Lily. This again, I think, is where linking it back to the biennial IWRS makes a lot of sense. I have not looked closely at the statutes to see if this is like, if that would be a supportable pathway. But it seems like that is periodical and also the right, like the subject matter aligns.
Thanks, Kaylin. Other thoughts?
Somebody notes in the chat, it would be helpful to have a time component, maybe no less than every 8 years to sync up with the IWRS. I like the idea of making sure that we're syncing up with other reports every 2 years. I'm not sure an evaluation works with how the timing would work up with the biennial work plans. But the IWRS is intriguing.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands. See, we got a thumbs up from Steve. April in the chat says, I agree a time component is needed. And Harmony says, strongly support ongoing program evaluation. Great. Thank you for all of that feedback. Anything else before we go on break? Okay. Not saying anything. Let's take a 5-minute break and come back at 10:05. We are right on schedule, so good job us. Yeah, we'll see you guys in 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Hey everyone, when you get back, if you could either come on video or give me a thumbs up just so I know that we have folks back in the room with us. Okay. Looks like we have most folks back. All right. Ryan. Oh, you raised your hand. I think you were trying to do it. Thumbs up. Okay. Let's get started. So moving on from rule language, our final agenda item for the day is a discussion about the economic and fiscal impacts and racial equity impacts of these rules. Your feedback on this is essential to the RAC process and will directly inform the statements of fiscal impact and racial equity impact that we are required to have as part of the rulemaking process. We're going to start with economic and fiscal and then move on to racial equity. For each part, I'm going to present the questions we need to answer and then seed the conversation with some preliminary impacts that we've identified as a place to start. You might have noticed that in the email we sent out last week, we did provide some draft language on both of these topics to just sort of get your brain thinking about these things. And the questions that we're going to go over were in the agenda as well. So for the statement of fiscal impact, we need to understand what state agencies, units of local government, and the public may be economically affected by the proposed rules and what those effects are likely to be. We also need to understand if there will be significant economic effect on businesses. And then specifically for the impact on businesses, we need to understand the cost of compliance on small businesses. Small businesses are defined at the bottom of this slide, but are basically for-profit and have 50 or fewer employees. For cost of compliance, we need to look at how many small businesses will be subject to these rules, what types of industries do these small businesses belong to, what are the expected reporting, record-keeping, and administrative activities required for compliance with the proposed rules, including costs of professional services, and what types of equipment, supplies, labor, and increased administration are required for compliance with the proposed rules. That's a lot. Let's go through each of the questions individually. I'll start with the economic impact on state agencies, units of local government, and the public. We have identified several impacts here as a place to start, but are really looking to you all with your experience and expertise to expand or react to these bullets that are on the slide and identify impacts we haven't considered. So on the slide, we've documented the staff capacity needed to administer the fund, provide technical information and planning support, and as grantees and conveners. Are there pieces we are missing here? And again, I'll give you guys a minute or two to think about things, but really any input into the impacts on state agencies, units of local government, and the public of these rules.
Lily,
Yes.
I don't, are you asking for us to tell you what we think the impacts are?
Yep,
Oh, okay.
that would be great. These are the ones on the slide. If you agree with them, if you don't agree with them, you can take them or leave them. If there are other impacts, yeah, just let us know what you think.
Is this only like kind of the negative impact side of things, or are you also looking at like the positive impacts? Do the rules
Oh,
just,
yeah, either way, positive or negative.
yeah, on the positive side, I see this as an opportunity for attracting additional money to Oregon to solve our water problems.
Harmony. That's a good point.
And yeah, from new and different sectors, so potential private investments, philanthropic investments. This is laying the foundation, I think, for a larger collective investment in water.
Anything else?
In the chat, Kaylin asks, where do tribes fit in to this, the economic and fiscal impacts?
I am happy to step in for that piece. So they are considered as part of this, although not explicitly a part of the statute. That is something that we're considering. Additionally, while we're not at that component yet, the racial impacts, a tribal specific impact is not required as part of that per the statute. However, that is something we're integrated into all of our notices as well. So if you have any comments on that, feel free to add to the discussion because it's critical to the analysis of the rule.
I'm uncomfortable with silence, but I know people are thinking. So if we move forward and you have things that come to mind as we move along, please feel free to share them. But we'll go to the next slide. But again, if you have thoughts, ideas come to you, we can always come back to this. The second question is whether there are significant impacts on businesses. We identified the primary impacts here to be on consultants being hired as project managers, facilitators, technical writers, or technical assistance providers, or in some case, even as a grantee. Does that make sense to you? Are there pieces that are missing? Are there impacts that are missing here on businesses generally?
One question I have here is, are nonprofits businesses or are they public?
I don't know the answer to that. Margo, do you know?
Yeah, I believe for purposes of this analysis, nonprofits are not businesses. Or let me circle back on that to confirm, but I think to my recollection, that's what it is.
Thanks,
I think-
Margo.
I think either way, if there are impacts on nonprofits, we can include it in our notice of proposed rulemaking. So if there are impacts that you've identified for nonprofits, please share those with us as well.
Well, I think the ones that come immediately to mind are the cost of participation, and there's significant time and resources and travel costs in order to participate in these. So I don't know. I would love for that to get called out explicitly, because I think the foundation of the question is that I don't know where these things fit in, and if there is a unique category for NGOs, it would be great to call it out. And if not, then I just want to make sure that that actual impact gets captured somewhere.
I think if it's not called out somewhere else, we can definitely call it out here in the public, like as a separate, the public, including nonprofits, and clarify all those impacts that you just laid out, Kaylin.
Thanks, Lily.
Anything else? on any of these things before we move into cost of compliance? In the chat, I see that Lisa Brown says, I agree with Kaylin. There is a very significant cost to nonprofits to participate in a place-based planning process, and it should be called out. Okay. Let's move on to the cost of compliance. Or Commissioner Thompson.
Thank you, ma'am. I don't know if my concerns, which are tangential to this process, are relevant, so feel free to tell me I'm off base. I'm coming at this from the housing standpoint and looking at supporting increased housing production, because we just had a meeting in Clatsop County Wednesday night where we're changing our law duck to allow I would say expedited housing production. We had a water district appear and say, basically, we don't want to cooperate with this. When I'm looking at economic and fiscal impacts, the lack of housing is related to water availability and the capacity and willingness of water districts, which are autonomous, independently elected public officials, to either support or obstruct it. So I don't know if that fits in this discussion, but I wanted to consider the issue. I wanted to raise it for your consideration.
Thank you. Okay. So we have a couple of, this slide is specifically on the cost of compliances for small business. We thought that the who here is likely the same as businesses, and that the reporting, record keeping, and administrative activities would depend on the specific contract. It would likely be within those expected for normal grant administration, along with additional reporting required for implementation progress reports. Do these bullets make sense? Are there pieces that are missing? You can go back to those specific questions about the cost of compliance for small businesses. It's just a lot to fit on one slide. Okay, not seeing anything. And knowing that you all can email me before the end of today with any thoughts after this, let's move on to the racial equity impacts of the rules. So with this statement, we need to identify who could be affected by the draft rules and how the draft rules could affect racial equity. I'm going to go similarly through some preliminary impacts that we've identified and then open it up for you all to discuss. So it's just some preliminary thoughts. All grants will be evaluated on their proposals for engagement of environmental justice communities. All grant types may support building the capacity of a community to engage in relevant planning, where community means the people impacted by the water resources of the planning area, entities with an interest or obligation related to water resources or ecosystems in or impacted by the planning area, and federal, state, local, and tribal governments. In practice, these rules are anticipated to foster more inclusive and equitable water resources management, ultimately leading to better outcomes for impacted communities. Consideration of state recognize place-based plans in the development of Oregon's IWRS offers the opportunity for diverse voices to have a further reaching impact into statewide planning efforts. And then no unintended adverse consequences on racial equity are expected from these roles. So just as a reminder, these are the questions that we're trying to answer. Do these the preliminary ideas I just went through make sense? Are there pieces that are missing? Does anybody have anything they'd like to add in terms of racial equity impacts? And that includes, Margot, this is what you were saying, right? This includes the tribal impacts as well.
Yeah, exactly. The statute, again, doesn't necessarily contemplate tribal impacts. However, that is going to be standard procedure in our agency moving forward to include a tribal impact analysis as a component of the racial impact statement.
I don't know if I'm going too fast. So Kim or Margot, slow me down if I need to create more space and time for comments. But if nobody has anything to add, I think I'm taking that as an endorsement of the bullets we had on that we presented, and we got it all.
Perhaps we can go slide back. Oh, there you are.
Yep.
Never mind.
And then this is the next group of bullets. Okay. Does that feel like a good amount of time? Okay. Great. Like I said, if anything comes up, if you think of anything later today, please feel free to send that my way. If things come up while we go over next steps, raise your hand and we can go back. Just want to make sure that everyone has the time that they need. Let's talk about next steps for the rules. So today, as we've said, is the last day for feedback to be considered in the draft rules published in the notice of proposed rulemaking, and that includes those impacts as well. Feedback on the impacts, the fiscal, economic, and racial equity impacts. We're going to take all of the comments you've made today, any written feedback we get, and prepare the rules for the for public comment. So we have to submit those, and they're going to get next week, and they're going to be prepared for a notice of proposed rulemaking published date of December 2nd. That will be the beginning of the public comment period, which will run through January 15th. We anticipate holding a hybrid public meeting hearing during that time where we'll accept verbal public comment on January 7th at 11 a.m. If you're interested, we'll send out notice when that gets finalized and scheduled. After the public comment period, we'll be considering all of the public comments as we prepare a final version of the rules to bring before the commission in March of next year. Again, if you have any additional input on what we've discussed today, please email it to me by the end of today. If you have any questions about the rulemaking process, please reach out to Margot. Has there been any interest in public comment in the chat? Does anybody in the room today want to provide public comment? Okay. Not seeing anything. So I just want to take a minute to thank you all for all of your hard work over the last 4 months. I know this is a time commitment and we really appreciate all of you for taking the time and helping us make these rules the best that they can be. Your input has been invaluable. So thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day and we'll see you sometime soon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Lily, I was thinking of stopping the recording. I think we need to stick around because we noticed, but I don't know if we need to record for
Yeah.
a lot of dead space. So I'll stop that. Or maybe I'll pause it and then I can reinitiate if we have anybody join.